So I went to Karim and I told him, look, if we buy wind farms in France for 200 million, 100 million in equity and 100 million debt, will you give me 5 million? We said, okay, of course. If you raise 100 million, I'll give you 5 million. Done. Went to Abu Dhabi and told them, look,
Of course, he never thought you'd do it, huh?
Yeah, the whole thing of also doing something good while you're investing, not just making money, it's a thesis that I liked from day one. And if you see, we've done after that education and healthcare.
Hi, and welcome to What I Did Next from A&T Media. I'm Malak Fuad, your host. Today, I'm bringing you a special episode with our sponsor, EFG Holding. I recently interviewed Karim Moussa, co-CEO of EFG Hermes Buy Side, head of private equity and asset management, as well as CEO of Vortex Energy. Even though Karim and I have many friends in common, we had never met. Yet, our conversation was easy and chatty. We talked about both his professional and personal life, and we started with his school days.
I was a naughty boy back in the days. I wasn't a good student. I was a troublemaker in Deo, and my colleagues or old friends would remind me of that. But my beginning of my career started with a tragedy, with the loss of my dad. I used to live with my dad. My mom and dad were divorced for a long period before. And because I was a misbehaving teenager, I was living with my dad mostly. And right before the last year of school, he passed away in the summer. And it was, for me, a big turning point. I grew up overnight. I had to take responsibility for myself immediately. And, from being, bottom top percent in class, I had to do ثانوية عامة. My German and was not that good to do Abitur. So I did ثانوية عامة and I finished with top 10% in class. And I ended up, packing my stuff and moving to Germany to study engineering and business in Germany.
Karim, it's really interesting that you took the experience of losing your father, it switched into a positive long term for you. A lot of kids would have gone off the rails even more. You were already going that way.
They expected me to do so at that time as well. I had no other choice. And I think it set the tone for a lot of what came after. It wasn't that easy as well immediately after, because the business of my dad went belly up, and there wasn't a lot of cash for me to study. So my mom used to send me some small amounts, and I had to, I studied engineering and business, which is in the German engineering schools, Wirtschaftsingenieurwesen, a tough degree to attempt. And I was working on the side. I did pizza man, I worked in construction side, I did movers, I did Santa Claus.
What do those side hustles teach you? Because you meet people that you wouldn't meet in your life today, but people I find who grow up in this way with, having to hustle and having to really do things on their own without help, they're so much more resilient. They have a resourcefulness that other people don't. Do you feel that about yourself?
Well, it teaches you to survive in a very, very early days when you're very young. And Berlin in the 90s, late 90s, was also a rough place. It's not like, you're studying in California on the beach. It's cold. It's it was still, coming out of sort of the East-West transition, and it wasn't an easy place. And studying engineering, German mechanical engineering and business in the same time while you're working, all kind of jobs was tough. But I, the first couple of years, I've done all these, these fancy jobs. And then I ended up, after finishing the Vordiplom, which is the so-called semi-bachelor in Germany, I ended up doing office work. So I worked part-time in a fund, Berlin Capital Fund, which was a biotech fund. And I started sort of understanding a bit, the finance world. But I was, at that time, sending faxes and typing in Excel spreadsheets. But I was earning good money. And since then, I actually called my mom with the age of 22 and told her I'm fine. I don't need any more cash. And since then, I've been financially completely independent.
That's such an inspiring story. And I think, when I hope young people listen to this. And I think about people like my own children who are beginning their journeys, like you were. And these are important stories, and not everything gets handed to you, and you have to figure things out, and you have to, find your own, well of resources inside to get you through it. I hope these stories resonate.
I'm actually reading a book right now, Green Lights, from Matthew McConaughey, which talks a lot about this. How life throws you into tough moments, worst times, humiliation, loss of friends and family, and he calls it red lights, and every red light at the end turns at one point of time to a green light, red and yellow lights, and it's really what you do out of it, and it's, I figured that out very early in my life, and it was, I mean, I had many red lights in my career, and the discussions maybe that we will continue with that came, but changing, facing the problem, pivoting and persisting into it, uh, um, and focusing on it, it will always turn green.
Do you look back on that time as being the hardest period? Because I went through a very challenging time when I was in my mid 30s. I got very sick. And now, when I'm confronted with anything that makes me nervous or I'm a bit anxious about, I remind myself that I won't ever go through the same difficulty as I did then. So it just becomes so much easier. Do you feel like that about that time in your
I mean,
life?
I don't remind myself, but I think it's plugged into you. It's like in your
Yeah,
coding, you're
yeah,
already programmed
yeah.
that,
I think I
how
understand that.
hard
Yeah,
is the next one compared to the previous one.
yeah. Let's start with Deutsche Bank. That was your first major job. Tell me a little bit about that. That was also in Berlin.
No, I joined in Frankfurt. I
Oh, you were in Frankfurt.
Yeah, I joined in September 2001. A very small team that does mid cap M&A, which I learned a lot in
Mhm.
that team. Doing mid cap German M&A, small transactions, small team, you get a lot of exposure to the deal making. I was, interacting with all these, Mittelstand German entrepreneurs, succession issues, also with big German corporates, EADS, Airbus, BMW, and you're getting a lot of exposure. And this team was doing a lot of transactions, sell side, buy sides, like 12, 13 transactions a year. So I've learned a lot, but I also didn't have an easy start. It's a very German environment, that mid cap market, and
And it
I
was right
joined the
after
team.
9/11, right? When you
I was just
started?
about to say, I joined the team September 1, 9 days after, and I was the only foreigner, not just Arab, the only foreigner
And
they've ever
yeah,
hired. 9 days after, an Egyptian pilot that studied in
yep,
Technical University of Hamburg, which is an hour away from Technical University of Berlin, in Germany, was one of the pilots that fell, that flew
yeah.
the plane in one of the towers. I honestly had some colleagues looking, afraid at me
Come
at
on.
one point. And there were all these very German, aristocratic teams. So, but anyway, I worked hard, and I succeeded, and proven myself. I got promoted over the years to an associate, and every time I had these HR, I was on a fast track. Every time I had these HR reviews, I told them, whenever you do something in the Middle East, let me know, and they called me one day and told me, look, they're going to open up in the Middle East. And there's this guy called Ken Borda who runs Australia and Asia, who's going to move to the Middle East, and he needs a business manager.
And Karim, why were you interested in anything to do with the Middle East? Because you obviously the language, the culture.
And by that time, I was spent 10 years in Germany, and I missed eating full utame and going back and hearing Aden and being in the Arab world. I had never been to Dubai. I did the video conference with Ken Borda, and I joined him. But this was a major red light that I discovered a year after. That job, I was a young deal maker, and that job, business manager, was more or less an extended secretary. I was taking minutes and booking private jets, and talking to the regulator to open offices, and negotiating office rents and stuff like that. and it was tough. I didn't like it at all.
And why did you do that? I mean, that was not a promotion,
I
right?
don't know. I was young, and I heard the I was an offer in Dubai, and joined the CEO to open up Deutsche Bank, and it was exciting. But the moment I had to literally carry his bag, which he gave me a few times to do, I said this is not going to work, and I didn't know what to do at that time. There was no investment banking, so I'm private bankers at Deutsche Bank. 2005 in Dubai, there was not even DIFC. We're in Emirates Towers. And he realized I'm the wrong guy in the job, and he just told me, look, I mean, there's an investment banker coming who's going to from Hong Kong, who's going to open an investment bank and give it a try. And I met him, and the guy told me, look, I don't want to hear about what you did in Frankfurt. I put you on probation. I had 6 years. I was in 6 years in Deutsche Bank, and in the fast, I put you on probation for 6 months, and prove again if you can do it or not. Otherwise, you're out. So after 6 years in my career, I went on probation period, and
Interesting.
then we did some interesting deals. I sold Sokhna Port to Dubai Ports. We did Dubai Ports IPO. We did EFC
But
Abra. So
Karim, you're obviously a risk taker because you could have stayed in the cushy job. You were on a fast track, but you went out and you said, no, I want to try something different. Even though the initial step wasn't to your liking, it led to something else. So there is a risk taker there,
you
which
have to,
isn't.
otherwise it becomes very boring.
Yeah, yeah,
Otherwise, your entire life becomes very boring.
that's true.
I
That's
think
true. But
at
a
the
lot of
moment
people
it
do that.
becomes boring, you have to start something else. Otherwise,
Yeah, yeah.
otherwise you'll degrade. 2005 to 2007, 8, 3 years, we did a lot of these transactions, good transactions, and then that's the time where also that business became boring. I was, the broker, the investment banker between, an entrepreneur selling, making a lot of money, or an investor buying, and restructuring or growing the business. And I was always the middleman. And, there's, for some people with some time, that business is not fulfilling. I wanted to be either the entrepreneur or the investor, and I decided to move to the buy side, to the private equity side. And I like the idea of EFG because Hassan and Yasser at that time, they hired a team from Goldman to ramp up their private equity. EFG was known as a big sell side brokerage and investment bank, but the private equity was still young, and
And
there
this
was
is what,
something to be done. So I joined them.
2009 by now?
That's right before Lehman, 2008. I negotiated before
2008.
Lehman, and then I joined right after the crisis.
And you had Ashraf Zaki in investment banking in Cairo at that time?
Yes, but he was leaving. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Hazim Shawi, the guy who came from Goldman, was effectively my boss at that time. And then and then we started. Then I started my career within private equity at EFG.
And let's discuss that a little bit in more detail. You are still very much involved in private equity. You're heading
Yeah,
it. How
yeah.
did those early years evolve to what you're doing now in that for that platform?
When I joined, there was a fund, the so-called old Horace fund. My first investment, having sold Sokhna Port to Dubai Ports, there was a project with a feedlot with lots of cows and some slaughterhouses that always interested me. And I went back to Captain Osama Sharif and told him, tell me more about this and connect me to your partner, that Danny Fakhri, who was running that project. They were importing livestock, and there is a shortage in Egypt with halal fresh meat. You can import frozen, but your baladi beef is you cannot. You don't have arable land and enough water to feed everyone with fresh meat. So the concept of importing livestock, putting them in a feedlot for a few months, and then slaughtering them on the ground, halal, and becomes like a premium baladi beef, cheaper than the baladi, was a great opportunity. We invested in a business, and we created the brand Sokhna Beef, and we were selling actually Sokhna Beef in Carrefour, and first year we did $100 million of revenue, and then the revolution came.
Yep. And that was a big for you
Yeah,
and for your work. It was a big pause.
completely. There was a series of change in ministries, and Egypt was not open for business. Actually, for some time after that, I was living most since '94. I left 95. I left Egypt, so I was at that time going back to Egypt. But post I paused and stayed in Dubai, and I said, okay, let's just do deals, outside Egypt. We were pretty much a big Egyptian focused fund and setup.
You shifted the focus. Instead of looking towards Egypt and inward, you persuaded the bank that it was better to look outward.
We had still life ammunition capital from the fund, and we could do regional deals. So the mandate was there. Although most of our deals were in Egypt, because naturally we knew the country best and
Yeah.
we were doing the best deals there. In parallel, we did this first infrastructure fund, Inframed, under the Union for Mediterranean, under Mohammed Rashid's leadership at that time. And we did there the first wind project. That's how we started understanding renewables, 114 megawatt a wind development in Jordan called Tafila, which was one of the first IPPs under the feed-in tariff in the Levant. So this was a line that was already, tailored to do things outside Egypt. Then back to setting a goal, I was telling the team, let's just look for undervalued listed companies and taking them private. So there was a theme that we focused on. We identified Damas as a very interesting company to do so with, and we ended up taking Damas private with Manai Group for $445 million transaction. We put ourselves $85 million from our fund, and a few years later we sold it at 2x and made like over 30% IRR, or a little bit less than 2x and over 30% IRR. So that was a good deal. That was the first sort of deal. And then, but at that time, we did not have any more money. The funds were done, and we had to start a new strategy.
At this point, you had only one deal in the renewable energy sector, and then
Yes.
it eventually evolved into Vortex down the line.
Absolutely. Q Invest, the Qataris, were attempting to invest in EFG or buy, EFG in 2012, and we started working with them, backed by the Qataris. There was a lot of capital, and they saw what we've done in the renewable space, and we've been asked to look at Turkey and try to find opportunities in the wind, specifically, like we've done in Jordan and Turkey. So with their introduction, we went a lot to Turkey. I never really managed to transact there. The Turks always think that the Arabs are going to rip them off, and the Arabs always think that the Turks are going to rip them off. So there's never a common ground on the.
It dates
at
back to
least
the
from my
Ottomans.
experience.
This is old history.
So we ended up, and then the deal fell apart with Qatar investing in EFG. So I ended up again from square zero. But then I told the team, you know what? The wind is not Turkish, and it's not Egyptian or Arabic or a German. And the turbine, whether you put it in the Middle East or you put it in Germany or France, it's the same turbine. Let's just go to Europe and let's pitch. We all came from Europe, most of the team as well. Bakr came from the UK. I worked in Germany. So let's just pitch them opportunities with feed-in tariff, with these government guarantees in Europe, to sovereign funds in the Middle East. The whole thing of also doing something good while you're investing, not just making money, is a thesis that I liked from day one. And if you see, we've done after that education and healthcare, and these are the only things that we do. And being a generalist, buying cement and food, and then hospitality and tech and everything in the same time, it doesn't work really, unless you're a KKR or a Blackstone. But we're a small team. You either become very good on something and then extract some value in it.
I like that though, Karim. I like that there is like a you're looking for things consciously. There's a method to it. Yeah.
So that was in 2014, which is the beginning of Vortex. And also thanks to EFG and thanks to Karim Moussa specifically, which is a company that really supports this innovation, which is very important. So I went to Karim and I told him, look, if we buy wind farms in France for 200 million, 100 million in equity and 100 million debt, will you give me 5 million so I can put 5% of the equity? He said, you're going to buy wind farms in France with what money? Like, we'll raise it from Abu Dhabi. He said, okay, of course. If you raise 100 million, I'll give you 5 million.
Of course, he never thought you'd do it, huh?
Yeah. Went to Abu Dhabi. We told them, look, would you buy, would you invest in operating wind farms, and we put 5 million of our own money, you put 95 million, we get debt for the remainder. And they were laughing at us. Have you ever done anything in renewable energy before? I said no, but we don't. We're not gonna do a blind pool. This is a specific deal. And long story short, we've convinced them. We went to the seller, which was EDP, the Portuguese utility. Mr. João Manzonetto, the CEO there, was laughing at us. That I remember that meeting. He told us, "You're a bunch of cowboys, but I like you. Are you guys going to deliver?" It's like, "Yes, you just come to Abu Dhabi once, and we will deliver." He
But
came to
it's
Abu Dhabi.
interesting, Karim, because you must have, at that time, it must have been really the seed of the idea for Abu Dhabi and the UAE to begin looking at renewables as a strategy. It must have been at the
We
very
were,
beginning of,
yeah,
I
we
think.
we were as a manager, we were one of the first to
Yeah,
get their allocation into renewables. And in 2014, remember, Malak, this is before the Paris Agreement. Nobody was
yeah,
talking about net zero at
that's
that
right.
time. No,
Climate
nobody. I mean,
change wasn't
I
on the
remember,
agenda.
I remember going to Naguib Sawiris to fundraise. He asked me actually why invest in renewables. He didn't understand the thesis of. People were just asking us why are you doing this?
Yeah, yeah,
It's such a
yeah,
niche.
yeah.
But we ended up buying 334 megawatts of 34 operating wind assets in France. We created Vortex 1 for 200 million. EFG put the 5 million, 95 came from Abu Dhabi, and 100 million from Deutsche Bank. And immediately after, we paid a 10% cash yield on that investment. So it was very, very good. And they've asked us for more. And this is how it started. And we were just doing the vortexes after that. The second one was a much bigger portfolio. By that time, the Paris
Yeah.
Agreement came. 2016, we invested in Portugal before Portugal was even investment grade.
And why did the business move to Spain eventually? Why did you leave France and move everything to Spain?
Spain is by far the most advanced country in the energy transition and renewable energy, by far, globally, in Europe and on a global stage. And then
Why
now
is that, Karim? I'm just curious. Why
they've
did Spain
started
become so
very
advanced?
early on. A lot of their engineers are from Spain. They've went through retroactive changes and adopted their system. They invested in their grid. They invested in regulations. They have a very big country with lots of empty land and lots of good resources in wind and solar. It's so it's
Interesting.
always it's in terms of standards, it's miles ahead of everybody else. But in 2016, it wasn't the case. We
Yeah.
liked it because we had a trusted partner. It was the same utility. They had a portfolio. We ended up buying 664 megawatt of a wind portfolio in Portugal, Spain, Belgium, and France. And this deal was in the neighborhood of 550 million, and the equity was like 200 something. We've raised it, same model, 5% comes from EFG and 95% from investors. And then Vortex 3, it's the first time we go into the solar space. We acquired a portfolio of solar assets in the UK. Also was troubled, Terraform Power and Sun Edison was like from a bankruptcy. And so it was always like something to be unlocked there. And here, in a period of a few years, we invested, over 1.6 billion in equity and debt.
And does Vortex have a footprint in Egypt? Because I know that the solar business is becoming a big thing in Egypt. Or are you an outside, out of the country business?
We're just primarily looking at these European markets.
Mhm.
And the reason was the Arab Spring. I mean, we started investing outside because the markets at that time that was attractive for renewable energy was Jordan and Egypt. They had feed-in tariffs. It was interesting, but the geopolitical dynamics and currency exposure to an extent, and again, remind you the history of where we came from with our legacy. So I was just like, we said, okay, and it worked.
Is today that thinking shifting or changing? Is Egypt
Yeah,
on your
yeah,
radar now?
yeah.
Because everything you described about Spain fits Egypt. Huge swaths of land in the middle that have nothing on them. You put solar panels.
No, and now with Egypt liberalizing the electricity market and the subsidies going away and
Yeah.
all of that becomes a very much more interesting
Yes.
environment to invest.
I want to ask you, because it's something we talked about in our last call. You mentioned about how you like the concept of decentralization when it comes to the businesses you're running. Why do you like it? What is it about the decentralized model that appeals to you?
I think the era of having a country head and and the product head and a coverage head and layers of organization and politics, at least in our buy side business, is not doesn't work. And when you're an investor, and portfolio manager takes care of his portfolio and invests, and he wants just to invest and divest and create returns for the investors. So when I took over, we said, okay, let's just decentralize, make it a multi-boutique sort of platform. You can add products. At the moment, we have three, and we'll focus on these three in the private equity space. And then we have FIM doing our regional asset management run by one CIO and his PMs, and Nabil Moussa in Egypt running Egypt asset management with his PMs. And then each of effectively the product heads for our verticals in private equity.
Is that an EFG policy, or is that something that you like to do within your spheres?
It's a policy I developed with our.
I see. So it's a bank wide structure.
Yeah, when I took over, we were sitting with the holding with Karim, being also a supervisor of all of this, and also the capital provider for a lot of our businesses.
Yes. Yes.
We came up with that solution oriented buy side platform because every business is completely different. Investing in wind farms in France and Spain has nothing to do with buying, Haya School and Slahat Tilmiz from us.
Yeah.
What we do is the juniors, when you start at EFG and in our buy side platform, as an analyst and associate, you do everything. You work on everything. You can work on Vortex deals, you can work on some schools deals, whatever we have. And once you sort of move up, you take a view on where you're going to be.
You make a choice. Yeah.
You make a choice, and then
Yeah.
you use one of these verticals.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk to me about education. It started in 2019. What was the thinking behind creating a fund for education?
The thesis worked. We're by far the largest student population in the region. 25 million of students population. Next one is Saudi Arabia with 6.5 million. We have 90% of our K-12 students in public schools. The public schools have issues. They're overcrowded. There's not a lot of funding. That 10% in private schools need to increase substantially. I mean, in the UAE, there's 73% in private schools. So there is an opportunity for private capital to make an impact. The problem is that, again, we had zero track record.
But by this stage, you're leveraging your previous involvement in the two, the private equity platform, into Vortex. You have the name of EFG behind you.
Going to some family offices in the Gulf and telling them I bought wind farms in France and I want to buy a school in Egypt, they laugh at us. So you have to start in a way and a little bit different, and that's how we also came up with how we started. So again, thanks to the gentleman I mentioned his name before, Karim Moussa, who did some interesting stuff supporting us and me. I heard that GEMS was thinking of opening up in Egypt, so that's a great operator. So I went to Sunny Barki and Dino Barki.
Is GEMS a UAE-based group?
Yeah, a very large one.
Yes, I've seen them in the UAE, but I wasn't sure if they were UAE or if they were an import.
Yeah. They have like 40,000 students or so.
Yes.
It's one of the largest strong operators in the region. So they had an attempt in Egypt and Alexandria did not work some years ago, and they were trying to find someone to show them the way in Egypt. We did this 50% joint venture. And I told them, look, and I then went to Mr. Hisham Talat, who had schools in Medinti and Rahab besides the hotels and besides his real estate. I figured out might not be core, and you could sell it, and with the relationships of EFG, we went and spoke to him, and we ended up convincing him to sell to us, and we bought his 4 schools, 3 in Medinti and 1 in Rahab, on balance sheet, because I didn't have a fund nor a track record. Bought in GEMS to operate them, and now had all the right ingredients. I had schools already in the portfolio. I had one of the best operator, in the market, operating them, and then we went fundraising. And in a matter of 3 months, we raised $150 million. What do you see? One of the easiest fund launches that we had
And
before.
how many
It
schools are part of the fund now, are part of the portfolio now?
Now we have 25 assets. Assets is across many things. So we own Slah Tilmiz, which is a beautiful business that does books for 4 million students. We produce 20 million student books a year. We own a transportation business that does purely bus transportation with the right health and safety, with the right application and tracking system for our schools and others, with transporting 3,000 students on a daily basis. We own kindergartens under the platform called Trillium, and we own Al Hayah, East and West. We bought it and opened another one. Now we're taking Hayah to Saudi Arabia. We own 6
And
schools
are
under
you
the
only
GEMS.
in Cairo in Egypt? Did you said originally the
No, we're
GEMS
in
had
Alexandria as well, and
also
we're in Suma Bay.
And are you looking to move further afield into the other governorates in Egypt?
Yeah. No, we're open to expanding. We're actually just under that platform. We've announced the university with Ms. Jamtalat and Noor City earlier this year. So that's
And
interesting.
what is
Higher education.
Mindsphere or Mindspire?
Mindspire. So last year in 2025, we replicated the same model and the same story um, in Saudi Arabia. As I mentioned, it's the second largest market, has very similar problems. Obviously, they're more cash rich than Egypt, but 85% of their students are in public schools. Only 15%, as mentioned, over 70% in the UAE are in private schools. So they're lagging behind even the GCC sort of benchmarks. They need massive amount of schools. I mean, the studies are around 400,000 seats. By 2030, that means every week there's 2 schools that need to open new from now to then. Obviously, Egypt is not Saudi, so we had to look for a Saudi team, and we sent some of our Egyptians to Saudi, but that time we could raise a fund because we had the track record, we had the story, we had the operator, and we had the know-how of operating, and we could go into Egypt. And by the way, the synergies are there. Egypt over decades ago, the teachers, all the curriculums were all based out of Egypt back in the days in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia. So we did not reinvent the wheel by sending teachers or doing teachers training from Egypt to Saudi Arabia. This is something that's been there since decades.
Absolutely.
It's just
Since the start of the
went
kingdom.
down in quality in the last few decades, and we're here to revive it again because we are Arabic speaking. We have the same culture, same
and there's traditionally been synergy in education between Egypt and Saudi for, as you said, for decades.
Absolutely, in education and in healthcare, but two sectors. We're now in our second year, and we're over $250 million of commitment. We've got all the big families subscribing into it and supporting us. We felt at one point of time Egypt education platform, Saudi education platform. It's a bit boring.
It sounds German though, Karim. Mindspire.
I have nothing to do with it.
Little German accent there.
Inspired with the pen. So we've launched the brand. So it's a and again, it's not a brand of a school. It's a brand of a holding that has multiple brands under. We own the brand the Gems in Egypt, or we have franchise agreement in Saudi. We have Hayah, we have Trillium. We can add a lot of other brands on. So it's a holding brand.
Are you looking eventually to roll the concept out into other markets in the Middle East? Are there other markets where this can be a viable proposition?
The answer is yes, yeah.
Like Jordan, maybe Palestine.
Smaller markets, but there are markets that are coming, starting from scratch, like Iraq. Massive, big market with lots of demand. So, but we're so busy now. We just started last year in Saudi, so we need to, the steps first one by one before we run to another thing.
So Karim, I want us to move on into a sort of a lighter part. You're constantly on a plane from all these different locations. What do you do to relax
Well, I'm starting farming in Spain,
as a hobby?
like as a hobby. Yeah, so we're
What are you going to farm?
planting a
What are
lot
you
of
farming?
all type of vegetables and fruits. And I'm getting chicken and donkeys soon.
I love this.
So that's something I do a lot.
Why that? Why did you go with that?
I love nature. I love being in nature.
Nice.
I try to do a lot of sports and listen to music.
So we're going to end with a signature feature of the show, which is called the lightning round. And I'm just going to throw out some sentences to you and just don't think too much, just answer. All right?
Yeah.
So if you had 25 hours in a day, what would you do with that extra hour?
Sleep.
Considering all you're doing and traveling all these places, I think sleep
Actually,
is a valid answer.
reflect is a better one.
Reflect.
Yeah, reflect is the right one. That's one of the things I keep on doing by reading these books now.
Don't you find that being on a plane is a very good place to reflect because you're kind of suspended?
Yeah, if you actually make it a point to reflect, because you can actually also, now with the internet, be on your WhatsApp and and start scrolling and watch a movie, and the plane is not. But if you really make it a point that you use that
Yeah.
time to do this, yeah, yes,
Yeah. Adrenaline junkie or beach bum?
adrenaline junkie.
The buzz of starting a new division or the business or satisfaction of seeing a business grow and mature?
Can I answer both?
Yeah, you can answer both.
Okay.
You like the beginning part where it's all exciting and new, and then you like to see it grow.
Yes, yeah, but I can. It's like saying you like apples more or oranges. I mean, I like both.
So before I go on with the rest of the lightning round, which of the three divisions is the most exciting? Private equity, Vortex, education fund, or is that a cyclical thing? Does
It
some of
really
them?
goes, yeah. I mean, and my team gets jealous when I spend more time with with one side and not the other side. But it depends on the times when you are building, raising money, and you need to focus on one area a bit more when the other one is investing or portfolio managing. And now we're gonna go with Ignis and exiting exit, so we just have to spend more
Yeah,
time. So it's really it flows over the years
yeah, yeah.
differently.
One of the things I'm doing with all my guests this year is, we're at a point, I think, globally, both economically, geopolitically, with AI, we're at an inflection point, I feel. And so I'm asking people to look ahead. We spent a lot of time looking back at your life, at your pivot points, but I want you to look ahead and I want you to think about what are the things you're excited about what's coming up.
It is very interesting to think about what's coming up, because I mean nobody can read the room as we speak. It's changing so fast.
Mhm.
Um, but if I am an optimist, you know, I hope this is where we're gonna go. Is like we're gonna do what we're doing with the help of a lot of computing resources, with much more higher efficiency, which will allow us to do much more that we would like to do. Whether it means more business, or go farming or do something else on the side. But I hope that a lot of the work that we will outsource to the computers will free up our resources to do more work or develop somewhere else, and
Yeah,
that's exciting.
yeah, it is exciting. We're thinking in the same sort of global issues. What are the areas you're worried about?
All these strange, geopolitical dynamics that we also cannot read. And I'm sad that we're going through these times. Very sad.
Do you also worry about the negativity of AI or the doomsday element of AI?
I try not to worry about too much about it. I'm trying to, when internet came, we all worried about internet, and we were all knowing what's going to happen, and it ended up in a very positive way. And I hope also we can control the direction of
Yeah,
the power into a positive way.
yeah, I hope so. If you had to choose another profession, what would you do?
I would do exactly the same thing.
Really?
Yes.
You felt like you landed in the right place.
I like what I do.
What's your favorite activity?
Being in nature.
Nice. What's your least favorite activity?
Doing routine work.
Okay. I'm going to say the beginning of a sentence and I want you to end it. I have a hard time.
Slowing down.
I get joy from.
Love.
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was really a
Thank you,
great
Malak.
conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Malak Fuad, and this episode was produced by Chirag Desai. We'll have a brand new guest in a couple of weeks. But before that, we'll be airing the panel discussion that I moderated in mid-May as part of the AI Summit that came to you from the amazing team at the Narrative Summit and E&. I hope you can join me then.